In February 1823, Lord Byron was living in Genoa in the Casa Sogliuzzo, the last of his Italian residences, and writing the 13th canto of his great parody epic, Don Juan. He had just entered his 36th and final year of life and was the most famous poet in the world. Behind him lay a life of quite extraordinary diversity and activity. Ahead lay his expedition to help the Greeks free themselves from the rule of the Turks. The poet was about to become the man of action he had always wanted to be, but he was still occupied with his masterpiece, Don Juan. He was tired and ready to die, but not only the poem itself, but also his home country, England, was haunting his imagination. An old monastery once, and now still older mansion of a rich and rare mixed Gothic. When the wind is winged from one point of heaven, there moans a strange unearthly sound, a dying accent driven through the huge arch which soars and sinks again, harmonized by the old choral wall. In Canto 13 of Don Juan, Byron brought his Spanish hero down to an unnamed Norman abbey, seat of Sir Henry and Lady Amundeville, to join a house party of British worthies. Isolated in Genoa, Byron found his mind going back to Newstead Abbey in Nottinghamshire, seat of the Byron family since 1540, and scene of many of the formative experiences of his childhood and early manhood. Bustling out of London, the whole party of assorted guests, including Juan, arrives at the Abbey in its spacious grounds in the middle of an English autumn. The mellow autumn came, and with it came the promised party to enjoy its sweets. The corn is cut, the manor full of game, the pointer ranges and the sportsman beats in russet jacket. The grounds of Newstead, with their lakes and formal gardens, are perfect for the entertainment of a house party, and Byron elaborates his description with loving emphasis. Before the mansion lay a lucid lake, broad as transparent, deep and freshly fed by a river. The wildfowl nestled in the brake and sedges, brooding in their liquid bed. Lording it over this scene is the mansion itself, the very epitome of Gothic, that romantic ambience which sent such delicious shivers through literary persons in the first years of the 19th century. Now louder, now fainter, the gale sweeps through its fretwork, and oft sings the owl his anthem, where the silenced choir lies with their hallelujahs quenched like fire. The gardens aren't quite as they were when Byron lived here, but the statue of the Virgin is still in the west front with the mighty window, and Newstead still has its Gothic fountain, not in the court, but placed in the cloisters. Newstead stands for England in Byron's years of exile. Indeed, it's one of the most English of country houses, having been an Augustinian foundation before the dissolution of the monasteries, and thereafter the perfect embodiment of the way of life of the landed gentry. Curiously, Byron himself didn't live at Newstead very often or for very long. It was leased during his childhood and sold in 1817, just after he left England, never to return. It's fair to say that today the atmosphere is not so much redolent of Byron himself as of the world he was born into, and of which he was so characteristic, yet paradoxical a rebel. Self-exiled in 1816 to escape the scandal which followed his disastrous marriage to the frigidly intellectual Annabella Milbank, the princess of parallelograms, as he called her, Byron had led a peripatetic and debauched life in Venice, Ravenna and Pisa before coming to Genoa, the last point before his commitment to Greece. His many liaisons had settled down to a constant attachment to Teresa Guiccioli, and more importantly, to the supreme poem of his career, Don Juan. Shelley had encouraged him to persist with Juan in the face of hostility and incomprehension. At last, as Byron took his hero through the corridors of power and fashion in London, and then into the country, he was able to devote all his loving hatred, his mordant but good-humoured satire, to England and the English people, showing up their monstrous vitalities and hypocrisies. When Juan alighted before the West Front, he would have gone straight into the Great Hall by a flight of steps, which has since been removed. But I have to make my passage instead through the crypt, with its memorials to the first Byrons. When house guests used these rooms, it was here they planned the diversions of gentlemen and ladies in the country. Here we remember the rakish young Byron, pistols, foils, boxing gloves, and his dog Bosun, who's buried in the garden. The gentlemen got up betimes to shoot, the young because they liked the sport, the middle-aged to make the day more short. The elderly walked through the library and tumbled books or criticised the pictures. And here's the first reminder of Byron the great poet, the earliest editions of his poems and some of his letters. He certainly wasn't born writing poetry well. Not until the Italian years, when he produced The Vision of Judgment, Beppo, and Don Juan, did he write poems the equal of the wonderful prose he'd always written in his letters. But this was after the works that made him famous, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and the romantic narrative poems like Mazeppa, and the heaven-storming dramas like Sardanapalus and Cain. This was the Byron the public loved, the man who influenced whole generations of European writers. But standing here in Newstead, I think of the other and greater poet, the English Byron, speedy, vernacular, and witty, master of the real world, and inheritor of the 18th century tradition of social satire. This was something which had been lost in the welter of Romanticism, in Wordsworth, in Keats, and in Byron's own early poems. He may have lived much of his life in the exotic South, but his talent was always more at home, pouring scorn on the moral North. Happy the nations of the moral North, where all is virtue, and the winter season sends sin without a rag on, shivering forth. 'Twas snow that brought St. Anthony to reason, where juries cast up what a wife is worth, by laying whate'er sum in mulct they please on the lover, who must pay a handsome price, because it is a marketable vice. Today, the great hall with its minstrels' gallery epitomizes Byron the social success. Certainly few poets of genius have been so firmly in fashionable society as Byron was. The world of Juan's country house party was also the world of Byron's intrigues with Lady Caroline Lamb and with Lady Oxford. But alas for appropriateness, Byron lacked the cash to restore the dining room, and instead of welcoming fashionable luminaries, it served him no more practical purpose than acting as a shooting gallery for his pistol practice. But in Lady Amundeville's Abbey, the whole panoply of guests, including Juan, would have met here for meals, and a fine parcel of Anglo-Saxon attitudes they make. The noble guests assembled at the Abbey consisted of, we give the sex the power, the Countess of Fitzfulke, the Countess Crabby, the ladies Silly, Busey, Miss Éclat, Miss Bombazine, Miss McStay, Miss O'Tabby, and Mrs. Rabbi, the rich banker's squaw. Also the Honourable Mrs. Sleep, who looked a white lamb, yet was a black sheep. There was Dick Dubious, the metaphysician, who loved philosophy and a good dinner. Angle, the soi-disant mathematician. Sir Henry Silvercup, the great race winner. There was the Reverend Rhodamont Precision, who did not hate so much the sin as sinner. and Lord Augustus Fitzplantagenet, good at all things, but better at a bet. Along the walls preside the ancestors of the Amundeville family. Steel barons molten the next generation to silken rows of gay and gartered earls, glanced from the walls in goodly preservation, and Lady Marys blooming into girls. Byron sums it up in one couplet. Society is now one polished horde, formed of two mighty tribes, the bores and bored. This is Byron's bedroom, a suitably romantic chamber where everything is just as it was in his lifetime. Yet it reminds me more of the amorous Jewin than it does of the lovelorn poet. This is another Byron paradox. Amongst all his affairs, his half-sister Augusta was probably the only woman he really loved. But if we put Jewin to bed here, we've set the scene perfectly for the ghostly happenings of the 16th canto of the poem. Newstead has its own ghost, a black friar whose appearance presages disaster for the witness. Byron is supposed to have seen this friar just before his marriage. Perhaps that's why he never brought his wife down to the abbey. One night, Jewin lies in bed hearing things, and not in vain he listened. Hush, what's that? I see. Ah, no, 'tis not, yet 'tis. Ye powers, it is pooh, the cat. Again, what is't? The wind? No, this time it is the sable friar as before, with awful footprints, regular as rhyme. Jewin goes to investigate and encounters the fearsome apparition itself. Jewin thrust his arm forth. Wonder upon wonder, back fell the sable frock and dreary cowl, and they revealed, alas that ere they should, in full, voluptuous, but not o'ergrown bulk, the phantom of her frolic grace Fitzfulke. The randy countess's intentions are hardly necromantic, and here the poem ends. Jewin's story ends in mid-air, but Byron went on to achieve a martyr's crown. Here we can set our minds on the end at Missolonghi, the pictures of the Greek heroes that Byron knew and despaired over. And here's a relic of the old romantic Byron, the helmet he designed to wear on the battlefield in Greece. Some months after leaving Genoa and dismissing his old home from his mind, he was dead. His death could be represented as the triumph of the romantic mythmaker over the realist poet. But Byron's personality remains a mystery. Does it belong, with his slightly absurd helmet, to the dead world of romanticism? I prefer to think that, like Newstead and Don Juan, it's part of the living world of his comic poetry, the greatest light verse in English literature.